you, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this launch event of the Youth Forum for Latin America and the Caribbean. It's exciting to see so many people who have joined from the region, but also from other regions. I see a lot of African friends and colleagues have joined, and that is exactly what we want to build at the Global Center for Climate Mobility, a global youth movement, a global youth constituency around this topic of climate mobility. We're happy that UNICEF and MYCP are joining us in this effort. And as you mentioned, also grateful to the support of the Robert Bosch Stiftung. The Global Center for Climate Mobility started work in Africa, and hence we have a following. I'm being asked about my language, and I'm going to do this. Sorry, guys. We started our work in Africa, and hence we have brought along a large constituency of African youth that we're starting to build now in Latin America and the Caribbean, where our work began a year ago and is entering an exciting phase with outreach to many constituencies over the next couple of months to engage a consultation process in the region. Our work is anchored around 3 pillars, and the first of them is titled Anticipate. Anticipate is really around how do we get a sense of what's coming, the future that climate change is imposing on communities in regions that are most affected by the climate crisis. How do we collect the data that is needed for people to understand current realities and future trends? And how do we make that information available to start a public conversation with different stakeholders, with governments, to help community-based planning and community transition, anticipating the changes that are coming and helping people prepare for those changes. What we find is that oftentimes people observe that things around them have changed. The environment is different, the weather is different, it's more hot, it's drier, there is more flooding. But not always is it clear that that's linked to a larger phenomenon called climate change. And not always is it clear for people how those changes in the environment will progress over the coming years and decades. And not always do they have access to warnings when there is maybe an extreme weather event, a storm, a flood, a landslide coming their way. And so this first bucket of work that we call anticipation is really around this question of what information do we need to make available to whom, and how do we get it down to those who need it most, where the action is needed most. And to identify those areas, we do something in every region, and including now in Latin America and the Caribbean region, that's called modeling. So we try to build future scenarios using data that is available and some data that is computed based on the data that is available to say, what is the likely future impact of climate change on the movement of people? And based on that modeling, based on those projections, we engage conversations, and we look forward to engaging conversations in this region with different stakeholders, including youth, to say, well, if this is the future that we might be looking at, what are the actions that need to be taken now to prevent future suffering, to prevent people from being negatively impacted, and to build resilience for communities that are likely to be most affected. So that first bucket of anticipation is really the foundation for a second step, and that is to plan. So once you have an idea of possible futures that are coming your way, how do you prepare and plan for those? And again, this process of consultation that we have undergone in Africa, that we are planning to hold here in the Latin America and Caribbean region over the next few months is to look at possible actions, courses of actions. What do we know about the places that are likely to be affected by climate change impacts? What do we know about the communities there? What do we know about the economies there? What do we know about the politics there? And given the current realities, what should planning, what should preparedness look like? What actions are needed on the ground? Those plans for us take two forms. We support regional agendas for action. So this is what we want to take to COP this year, COP 29, which will be held in Baku. We want to bring an agenda for action for Latin America and Caribbean that is co-developed with all of you, with the youth of the region, that is co-developed with policymakers from the region, that is co-developed with community representatives from the region, so different constituencies, but we count on the input and the contribution of the young people from the region in shaping this agenda for action. And then in the next step, what we do and what we're currently doing in Africa is working at the national level. So looking at how can we support national level policy making, but also community level, local level planning and policy making to, again, like based on the information that we have on, what are likely climate mobility scenarios, what's the action that we can take? So that's the second part, is the planning part. And then the third part goes to the action and to the what we call enabling. So we have data, information, we have some plans, but how do we actually make things happen? And we're banking on three things. One is helping governments, once they have a plan, once they have a policy, access funding from international organizations, funding mechanisms such as the Climate Fund. So how do we support basically the unlocking of resources that is based on governments having plans and policies in place? The second plank is the action that comes from you, that comes from other stakeholders. So how do we make resources available to the broader ecosystem of actors that really needs to come into play? Young people that are already doing work, working on improving water availability in their communities, improving data access in their communities, coming up with new ways of dealing with waste or dealing with energy generation. So how do we support that action, entrepreneurship, organization of young people directly, but also cities, for example, or women. So we're looking at a whole range of constituencies and how we can support their actions. And then lastly, we're looking at enabling coalition building across regions, and that's happening here. That's happening also with governments. So we provide platforms such as the Climate Mobility Summit during the UN General Assembly in New York, the Climate Mobility Pavilion at the COP, at the climate summits of the UN, where there's a space that different actors can come together, discuss what they're doing, discuss what their priorities are, and put them forward together to shape the international agenda. And that's another form of enabling action that's more on the political side, more on the agenda shaping side, but that we think is critical in the longer term to unlock resources and make progress on this issue. We know that so far the climate agenda is still very much framed around carbon emissions, decarbonization, and that's important, but there's a few heavy hitters, a few countries that really need to move the needle there. We know that there's a whole climate agenda that's about people and the impacts of climate change on people, and that's the global majority that really is concerned here. And so how do we elevate the people-centered, the people-positive climate action agenda so that there is the possibility for people to adapt in a way that has positive outcomes, and we're not looking at loss and damage but we're looking at preventing loss and damage. That's what we're working on, and that's what we're excited to work on with you. The young people have been, I would say, our strongest allies, our strongest champions so far, and we're really here to listen how we can best support you, how we can co-develop solutions with you, from everything to climate literacy and raising awareness to the more practical solutions I mentioned that can improve livelihoods on the ground. And so I'm looking forward to this discussion, to starting this process with you in the region, and then again also across regions as a global coalition that moves this agenda. So thank you very much.